Hi, I'm Dr. Jeremy Neal. I'm a professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University. I want to talk today about some common criticisms of John Rawls' theory of justice and especially of his original position. I've mentioned elsewhere in other videos the basics of the original position, and I mentioned at least one other criticism of the original position, namely the criticism that people might not necessarily be risk averse in the way that Rawls thinks that they would. Today I want to talk about some other potential ways of criticizing the original position, including especially the criticism that Rawls sneaks into the original position certain assumptions that in fact slant the development of principles of social cooperation in ways that are in accordance with his own desires and wishes. So, for instance, the persons in the original position stand as individuals. They are representatives of family lines, choosing in their capacity as individuals principles of justice for themselves and for their society. So their individual status is taken to be primary. It's taken by Rawls, or at least is assumed by him, to precede their participation in a social group. But why are we to assume that the individual and the interests of the individual ought to be taken to be primary in this way? The individualism that is built into the original position ensures that the principles of justice that are chosen in the original position will indeed be principles of justice that will be individualistic, principles of justice for a society that will be radically, in fact, individualistic. So one reason why I struggle with the original position, and just as an editorial comment, I'm not necessarily a fan of the original position. I have great respect for Rawls, but I'm not necessarily a fan of the thought experiment that he conducts in order to ascertain principles of justice. At any rate, one problem that I have with the original position then is that I think that Rawls does indeed stack the deck. And one way that he does so is by building individualistic assumptions into the original position. Another assumption that I'm not sure I would necessarily want to give Rawls is that persons in the original position have as a moral psychology a native egoism. I'm not sure that I'm going to give that to Rawls, or that I would want to say that persons are naturally egoistic in the way that Rawls thinks that they would be in choosing principles of justice for themselves. So I have religious convictions. I'm a Christian philosopher, and I know many persons, Christians, who are sincerely pious, who sincerely are living their lives not for their own sake, but for the sake of other persons. So it strikes me that Rawls' original position really has no place for saints in it, for persons who are interested primarily in devoting their lives to the interests of others rather than in the achievement of their own interests. Still, another criticism of the original position is that it is ahistorical. This famously was raised by the philosopher Robert Nozick, and the criticism is that Rawls builds into the original position ahistorical assumptions that are completely implausible in real-world scenarios. So Rawls in particular seems to be assuming, according to Nozick, that material resources fall like manna from heaven into human societies. But that's not true at all. In fact, human beings work for material resources, and they develop for themselves the constituents of their lives together over a period of time, and often through a lot of very hard work and difficult choices. For instance, take two people. Suppose I were to tell you that there are two men, both of them aged 65, and both of them in need of a kidney transplant. Both of them are in danger of death within a month if they don't get a kidney transplant. So it is imperative that we find kidneys for these guys. If that's all the information that you have before you, it might be difficult for you to make a choice if, say, a kidney became available and you were a hospital administrator or doctor. It might be difficult for you to make a choice between the two men about who should receive the transplanted kidney. But suppose I then were to tell you that person A is in fact a man who has lived his life rather selflessly. Suppose he has worked very hard, he's achieved in life, and has been incredibly altruistic, giving his possessions away for inner city development and support, maybe working in his local church, teaching children of underprivileged families to read, or who knows what other altruistic endeavors. And he has now, through happenstance, perhaps through very bad circumstances, been the subject of a disease that has caused his kidneys to cease to function, circumstances that were not his fault. Suppose now that I tell you that person B, the other man who's 65, has in fact trashed his kidneys through years of terrible living. Bad eating practices, maybe alcohol and smoking were involved, and in fact that his kidney failure is a source of his own choices, a product of his own choices. Given this history, suddenly if I were a hospital administrator, would approach the issue of the kidney transplant very differently than if I had no knowledge of this history. So the fact of the history is important, at least it seems, in real life circumstances in our distributive justice decisions, especially in our allocation of resources among persons. When that history is one that we think is conducive to, or one that entails that someone should receive a higher allocation of material resources, we want to give that person the higher allocation, and when it is not, we don't want to give that person the higher allocation. At least that's my basic intuition. And the criticism of Rawls is that Rawls, in fact, in the original position, is completely disregarding history. He's completely disregarding the fact that human beings make choices, and that sometimes these choices have consequences, including especially material consequences that have to do with the division of resources. Rawls instead seems to be assuming that we should divide the resources of society up without regard to persons' historical circumstances, their own histories, the histories of their family clans, the histories of their societies, and so forth. But this seems completely wrong-headed, especially in comparison to the way in which we make real-life decisions about the distribution of resources. So those are three quick criticisms of the original position, reasons why many people have found the original position to be unconvincing, and reasons why I struggle very much to agree with Rawls that the original position is indeed an appropriate way to think about the division of resources in society.